The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless 60-cycle song as Brooke Sullivan pushed through the ICU doors at 0600, her badge clipped to scrubs the color of hospital fog. 8 months. 243 days of invisible work, of documented details that mattered to everyone except the people who needed to notice them most. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite mixed with something underneath it, something organic and raw that no amount of floor wax could erase. She moved past the nurse's station without announcement, her shoes clicking softly against linoleum that had been mopped at midnight by someone whose name nobody asked. Room for 12. Post-op thoracic patient, day 3 of recovery. Brooke's eyes swept across the monitors before her hands touched anything. O2 sat 94, heart rate steady at 68, pressure holding at 118/74. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside the bed, and she adjusted the sedation drip without ceremony, her fingers steady as surgical lasers despite the weight of what she actually was. Her left forearm brushed against her scrub sleeve, and she felt it there beneath the fabric, the thin scar tissue from shrapnel in Fallujah, 17 years ago. She covered it like she covered everything else. Long sleeves. Deferential posture. Eyes down when it mattered. The jacket hung in her locker, standard issue wool, nothing that would make anyone look twice. But inside the lining, carefully stitched between the wool and the lining silk, was a patch the size of a postage stamp. Faded olive green. A 6-point symbol with a curved blade running through it. Reaper 6. That had been her call sign. That had been her life before the Pentagon had decided she could serve a different way, not in Tikrit anymore, but here in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a hospital billing department that was bleeding money in a pattern that looked almost artistic if you knew what you were looking at. She did. Chart review was supposed to be routine. Supposed to look like what every competent ICU nurse did, scanning the medication log, noting the vitals, checking the doctor's orders against the patient's actual condition. But Brooke was reading something else entirely. Dr. Pierce had coded this patient's last 2 days as grade for trauma intervention when the actual condition chart showed stable recovery, minimal intervention, mostly supportive care. The billing codes were inflated by approximately $8,000. Grade 4 meant heroic measures. Grade 4 meant emergency procedures, constant monitoring, specialized expertise. Grade 4 meant insurance companies wrote bigger checks. Her right hand reached toward the chart's edge, then stopped. She was being watched. Not directly, not the way civilians understood watching. But she could feel the shift in air pressure when someone's attention turned toward you, the way her training had taught her to feel it in the dark, in compounds where your life depended on knowing who saw you before they moved. Dr. Pierce had just entered the ICU from the corridor. His footsteps came first, expensive shoes on linoleum, the kind of shoes that cost more than her monthly car payment. Then his voice, loud enough to be heard 3 rooms down. Sullivan, morning report. Now. She closed the chart. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. She turned with what would have looked to anyone watching like appropriate deference, her eyes level but not challenging, her shoulders slightly rounded in the way that made her smaller than she actually was. The submissive posture of someone who had learned that invisibility was survival. Room for 12 stable. Post-op day 3. Vitals in normal range. Sedation holding. No complications overnight. Dr. Pierce was a man built for authority, tall, silver-haired at 53, the kind of presence that made rooms acknowledge him without anyone saying anything explicit. He wore his white coat like armor, buttoned at the waist, his hands in the pockets in a way that made them look decorative rather than functional. His eyes moved across her report the way a man looks at a painting he's already decided he doesn't like. You're charting too much. The words fell into the space between them like stones dropped into still water. Brooke had been expecting something like this for 7 weeks. The documentation was part of her assignment, of course, every procedure, every code notation, every moment where the medical reality diverged from the billing codes. But to Dr. Pierce, detailed charting looked like challenge. Like a nurse who was checking his work. Like a problem. I document what I observe, she said. Her voice was soft. Accommodating. The voice of someone who understood the hierarchy and respected it. It's in the charting standards. Excessive notation creates confusion. It suggests uncertainty about the diagnosis. The statement was backwards in a way that suggested he knew it. Detailed charting was protection for the patient, for the staff, for the hospital. Everyone in this ICU knew it. But nobody would say so while he was standing there radiating the kind of confidence that came from 8 months of watching nothing happen to him. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had spent 30 years in medicine without ever questioning whether he belonged there. Going forward, simplify your notes. We don't need play-by-play documentation of routine recovery. He glanced at the monitor once, the gesture dismissive, then turned back toward the corridor. Rounds in 10 minutes. He was gone before she acknowledged the instruction, which was exactly what he wanted, the confirmation that she understood he had spoken and she had listened and the matter was closed. But her hands knew better. They knew that detailed charting saved lives. They knew because they had done it in a surgical tent in Tikrit, bleeding out their own blood onto canvas floor under lights powered by a generator that never ran quite steady enough to feel reliable, writing down every procedure, every medication, every moment when the person in front of you went from stable to crashing to somehow, impossibly, breathing again. The ICU around her continued its rhythm. The ventilators breathed for their patients in measured pulses. The heart monitors beat their steady count. 2 nurses at the station traded notes about night shift, voices low, the comfortable exhaustion of people who had survived another 12 hours. Brooke moved through it all like she was part of the landscape, one more piece of the machinery that kept this place functioning. Her fingers felt the edge of the unit patch through her jacket as she gathered the morning labs. Reaper 6. Captain Sullivan. The person who had trained 14 months with SEAL Team 3 before she was assigned to Charlie Platoon as combat medical specialist. The person who had performed 17 emergency field thoracotomies in 72 hours during the siege at Tikrit. But that wasn't visible here. That wasn't supposed to be visible. The entire point of Naval Intelligence's placement was that Dr. Pierce would never see her as anything other than a competent but overly cautious nurse who took too many notes and didn't understand the difference between appropriate documentation and paranoia. The ICU charge nurse, Diana, was waiting by the medication cart when Brooke turned the corner. Diana had been at Cedar Creek for 14 years, long enough to know how things actually work versus how they were supposed to work, but not long enough to do anything about it. The frustration lived in her shoulders, in the way she moved through the day like she was pushing against something heavier than air. "You heard about the transfer?" Diana asked. Brooke kept her eyes on the medication log she was reviewing, her pen moving with practiced precision. "Not yet. Incoming from Germany. Should be here by 1100. Medevac from Bagram, critical priority." Diana lowered her voice, the way people did when they were about to say something that mattered. "He's a Navy SEAL. Wounded in Tikrit. Name is Marcus Chen." The pen didn't stop moving. Brooke's breathing didn't change. The chart continued its documentation beneath her hand, the same steady, careful documentation that Dr. Pierce had just told her to simplify. But somewhere in her chest, something that had been still for 8 months shifted position. Tikrit. Marcus Chen. She knew that name. She knew it from before, from the previous life, from the time when she had been Captain Sullivan and he had been the combat medic who volunteered to go on the patrol that took her out of the field, who had made the decision to replace her on rotation so she could spend the next 72 hours sleeping in something that wasn't sand. Good medic. Competent. The kind of person you didn't think about for 3 years until you suddenly did, and the weight of that absence hit you like artillery. "He'll need an experienced post-op team," Diana continued, watching Brooke's face for some kind of response. "Dr. Pierce is already talking about his course of treatment. Something about phase-extended recovery protocols." "How bad is the wound?" Brooke asked. Her voice hadn't changed. The question sounded like the kind of thing any ICU nurse would ask about an incoming critical patient. "Explosive injury. IED. Shrapnel embedded in the chest cavity. They stabilized him at Landstuhl, but he's still on heavy sedation." Diana paused, and in that pause lived the thing she wasn't saying directly. Pierce has already flagged it as a potential extended care situation. Meaning billing codes. The medication cart rolled forward smoothly under Brooke's hands. Her fingers moved through the doses with the muscle memory of someone who had checked medications on combat medics in forward operating bases, who understood the difference between what looked good on a chart and what actually kept someone breathing. O2. Vasopressors. Paralytic agents for sedation. Her hands knew these things the way other people knew their mother's voices, not by thinking about them, but by existing in a world where they mattered. "When will he arrive?" she asked. "Within the hour. They're prepping Trauma Bay 3. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. The ventilator in 412 wheezed its steady rhythm. And somewhere over the Atlantic, approaching U.S. airspace, a Navy SEAL who had once replaced her on a rotation was coming home in condition critical, with no idea that the nurse who would be standing in that trauma bay had spent 3 years training in the same sandstorms, working under the same impossible pressure, learning to keep people alive in conditions that had no margin for error. The morning rounds would start in 7 minutes. Dr. Pierce would move through the ICU with his expensive shoes and his inflated billing codes, dismissing her observations, confident in his authority, certain of his position in this hierarchy. He would see a competent but cautious nurse who documented too much and understood too little about the practical realities of running a hospital. He had no idea who was about to walk through those trauma bay doors. The trauma bay doors burst open at 0847, and the stretcher arrived with the kind of controlled chaos that separated the competent from the panicked. 2 paramedics called out vitals in rapid succession, GCS of 8, intubated at scene, blast lung confirmed, shrapnel wounds to abdomen and left flank, 2 units whole blood running wide open, while the receiving team moved in practiced unison. Brooke stood at the monitor station, watching the stretcher roll past, and felt something shift in her chest the moment she saw the patient's face. Marcus Chen. Her hand stayed steady. That was the first test. He looked different under fluorescent lights, thinner, older than she remembered, with the kind of pallor that came from losing too much blood too fast. His left arm was wrapped in emergency bandaging that had already begun to seep. The ventilator tugged at his throat with mechanical rhythm, each breath forced and artificial. Blast lung would do that. She'd seen it 3 times in Tikrit, twice in Sanjin Valley. The lungs filled with fluid after explosive trauma. Without careful management, the patient drowned from the inside. She recognized the scars on his right shoulder. She'd sutured that wound herself in a forward operating base, 2013, 72 hours into a siege. That scar had faded to white. Now it was being packed with fresh gauze as the surgical team rushed him toward the ICU. Brooke pulled up the intake form on her workstation. Captain rank. Navy SEAL, 3rd Platoon, transferred from Tikrit Joint Operations Center. The hospital administrator had briefed her yesterday, a high-profile case, media attention likely, family would be emotional. She'd nodded, taken notes, maintained her neutral expression. She hadn't mentioned that she knew exactly who Marcus Chen was. The receiving team stabilized him in ICU Bed 7, the same bed that would become the center of everything. Brooke completed her initial assessment with meticulous precision, documenting every procedure, every medication, every subtle clinical change. Blast lung. Massive hemorrhage. Shrapnel embedded in the left lower lobe. 2 ribs fractured. Pneumothorax developing on the right side. She documented the needle decompression they performed at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She noted the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the hiss of air escaping. She recorded his oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 89%. All of it went into the system, meticulous, detailed, the kind of charting that showed exactly what had been done and why. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0923, moving through the unit with the kind of unhurried confidence that came from knowing nobody would question him. He was tall, silver-haired, the sort of physician who wore his wealth like cologne, Rolex, Italian shoes, a wedding ring that caught light like a weapon. Brooke had been documenting his billing patterns for 8 months. She knew his name appeared on trauma code submissions for patients who never left their beds, patients who required minimal intervention, patients whose insurance paid out catastrophic injury rates regardless of actual care provided. She had files. Names. Dates. Dollar amounts. The next words out of Pierce's mouth changed everything. Nurse Sullivan. My office. Not a request. A command. She followed him down the corridor, past the family waiting area where Chen's parents sat motionless, his mother's hands in her lap, trembling, his father's jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. They looked up as Pierce passed. Neither of them looked at Brooke. Pierce's office smelled like expensive cologne and leather. He closed the door and turned to face her, holding her nursing notes in his right hand. They were printed, highlighted in yellow, the sections where she documented every procedure, every medication, every clinical observation. He moved like a man who'd never been questioned, who assumed his authority was so absolute that challenge was simply not a possibility. These charting notes, he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man addressing someone beneath contempt. They're excessive. Brooke said nothing. She'd learned that silence was more powerful than any response. You're documenting procedures that don't require this level of detail, Pierce continued, his eyes flicking across the pages with visible irritation. Are you trying to make the rest of the staff look incompetent? Or maybe you're just too inexperienced to know what actually matters. 3 seconds. She let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds while his eyes locked with hers. If you spent half this energy on actual patient care instead of creative documentation, Marcus might have regained consciousness yesterday. The words came out flat, clinical, without inflection. Her voice had dropped an octave, something in her training surfacing beneath the deferential nurse persona. Pierce's jaw tightened. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or the first sense that this particular nurse wasn't going to behave like the others. He recovered quickly, his face flushing red at the wrists. You're dismissed. She turned and walked out. His next words came as she reached the door, and Nurse Sullivan. I'll be filing a formal review of your performance. Excessive charting creates liability. The break room at lunch was where the real isolation began. Brooke had eaten alone before. She'd eaten alone in military dining facilities while junior enlisted personnel whispered about the captain who'd lost her combat status. She'd eaten alone in the cafeteria of her daughter's elementary school because she'd missed 6 parent-teacher conferences. Alone was familiar. Alone was safe. What happened in the Cedar Creek break room was different. She sat down with her tray, turkey sandwich, black coffee, a single apple, and arranged them in front of her with careful precision. Within 30 seconds, the conversation in the room shifted. The 3 nurses who'd been standing by the refrigerator exchanged glances and migrated to a table by the window. The 2 sitting on the couch gathered their things and left, mentioning something about back-to-back admissions that nobody had mentioned 5 minutes earlier. The room became islands. Brooke became the empty sea between them. From the hallway, she could see Pierce talking with 2 hospital administrators, both of them leaning against the counter with the body language of men having an important conversation. One of them, the hospital's chief financial officer, a man named Bancroft with the kind of jawline that suggested money had been in his family since before money was invented, gestured toward the break room window where Brooke sat today. Pierce smiled. She watched him point, watched the administrators nod with the kind of understanding that didn't require explanation. The network was mobilizing. She'd seen this pattern before, in officers who decided a particular soldier was a problem. One of the nurses at the far table said something. The others laughed. It wasn't loud enough that Brooke could hear the words, but it was loud enough that she could hear her own nickname carried through the room like a blade, Captain Clipboard. Pierce's invention. Clever enough. Demeaning enough. The kind of nickname designed to strip authority and suggest incompetence in a single phrase. She didn't respond. She never responded to nicknames. She ate her sandwich while her coffee grew cold in front of her, and she thought about the fact that Marcus Chen was still unconscious in bed 7, that his oxygen saturation was still climbing, and that her careful documentation was now the target of institutional pressure she'd expected and prepared for. The third humiliation came during shift change. Pierce posted the formal write-up on the unit bulletin board at 16:30, placing it in the center of the corkboard where 12 staff members were scheduled to gather for change of shift briefing. Brooke watched him pin it in place, a white sheet of hospital letterhead with his signature at the bottom, his official seal at the top. She read it from 8 feet away. Formal Performance Improvement Notice, Staff Member Name, Brooke Sullivan, RN, ICU Unit. Date, Current Shift. Issued by Dr. Harold Pierce, Senior Attending Physician. Performance issues, failure to follow department charting protocols, excessive documentation indicating poor time management and possible anxiety-driven behavior, questionable clinical judgment in escalating routine post-trauma assessments beyond standard care guidelines. The language was perfect. Each phrase had been selected to destroy. Not accurate charting, excessive documentation. Not careful observation, anxiety-driven behavior. Not appropriate vigilance, questionable clinical judgment. The words were surgical. Precise. Designed to plant seeds of doubt that would grow in the minds of anyone who read them. Pierce read it aloud during shift change, standing in front of the gathered staff with the document held like evidence in a trial. I've issued a formal performance improvement notice to Nurse Sullivan regarding her charting practices. Moving forward, all documentation must be approved by a senior nurse before being entered into the system. No exceptions. This is about maintaining professional standards and preventing unnecessary documentation that creates liability for the hospital. Brooke stood motionless at the monitor station, hands at her sides, jaw set like iron. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from training, from years of standing in conditions where showing emotion meant death. Her fingernails pressed crescents into her palms. She said nothing. Simply watched. Observed. Documented the moment in the same way she documented everything else, with meticulous precision and zero emotional response. After Pierce finished and the staff dispersed, she walked to the bulletin board, photographed the notice with her phone, and returned to her station. The supply room was empty at 16:47. She closed the door and pressed her hand against her jacket lining, feeling the outline of the unit patch she'd sewn there, faded green fabric with the emblem of a forward surgical team, the symbol of 18 consecutive field surgeries in 72 hours, the symbol of the life she'd left behind in Tikrit. The fabric was rough beneath her fingers, worn from 3 years of contact against her ribs, worn from being carried into this hospital as proof of who she really was. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce's behavior, the documented campaign of humiliation, the fabricated performance issues, the network of complicit administrators watching from hallways, fit exactly into the fraud pattern she'd been sent to document. 8 months of careful observation had shown her that Pierce used public humiliation to isolate medical staff who documented his inflated trauma codes. 8 months of watching him discredit anyone whose charting might expose the fact that he was submitting catastrophic injury claims for patients who never left their beds, who required minimal intervention, who were mechanisms for converting insurance money into salary increases and office renovations. She had the evidence. She had the pattern. She had everything she needed to expose him. The problem was that exposing him meant exposing herself. Her handler at Naval Intelligence had been clear about that during their last encrypted call. The fraud investigation takes priority. You've been documenting Pierce's billing patterns for 8 months. The Chen transfer doesn't change the mission parameters. But it did. Somehow, it absolutely did. Brooke pulled up Chen's chart and reviewed the 2-day post-arrival progression. Oxygen saturation had stabilized at acceptable levels. Blast lung was responding to aggressive fluid management. The shrapnel wounds were stable. By all clinical measures, he was tracking toward recovery. But something in the numbers bothered her: subtle changes in his heart rate, elevation in respiratory rate, a slight decrease in oxygen saturation that the monitors flagged as normal post-trauma fluctuation. She'd seen that pattern before. Pulmonary embolism. Not massive. Not immediately catastrophic. But developing. Slow enough that it could be missed by a doctor who wasn't looking closely. Fast enough that it would become critical within 36 hours if nobody intervened. She documented it anyway. Meticulous charting. Detailed notes about the subtle changes she was observing. Clinical observations that would create a record of her vigilance, her attention, her competence. And she watched Pierce read her notes and dismissed them. Post-trauma fluctuations, he told the resident at 0930 the next morning. Normal cardiovascular response to massive hemorrhage and shock. Stop escalating routine observations into emergency scenarios. That's how we create unnecessary interventions that eat into our operational efficiency. He reassigned her to another patient that afternoon. Restricted her access to Chen's room with the explanation that she was too emotionally involved and creating unnecessary alarm. His words were designed to undermine her without directly ordering her away from the patient. Institutional pressure. Death by policy. Brooke spent the evening in her car in the hospital parking lot, phone pressed to her ear, voice tight with controlled anger. The mission is compromised. If I act, I expose everything. If I don't, Chen dies. The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds. The fraud investigation takes priority, her handler said. You've been documenting Pierce's billing patterns for 8 months. Chen knew the risks. She ended the call before she could respond to that. At home, Jackson was already asleep when she arrived at 21:15. She'd missed dinner. She left him a note on the kitchen counter. Mom had emergency shift, leftover pasta in the fridge, love you. The lie came naturally now. The deception had become so practiced that it felt more authentic than truth. She pulled the shadow box from the back of her closet, the one hidden behind winter coats she never wore. Navy Cross. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat citations from Tikrit that documented what she'd done during that 72-hour siege. Jackson didn't know any of it existed. Jackson didn't know his mother's name had been called out in military formations, didn't know she'd been decorated for actions she'd never discussed, didn't know the reason she'd retired from Naval Intelligence was that she'd become too visible, too compromised, too much of a security risk. She was staring at the medals when her phone buzzed at 0230. Code Blue ICU Bed 7, Marcus Chen. Brooke closed the shadow box, placed it back in the darkness, and moved toward the door with the muscle memory of someone who'd answered emergencies in countries with names she couldn't speak on American soil. She had no idea what was about to happen would change everything. The next 48 hours became a masterclass in institutional sabotage wrapped in the language of patient care. Pierce's public humiliation had backfired exactly the way he'd hoped, not by breaking Brooke's composure, but by giving him cover for what came next. On the morning after the break room incident, Brooke arrived for her shift to find the assignment board reorganized. Chen's name was no longer on her roster. Instead, she'd been reassigned to 3 other ICU beds, a post-op bypass patient, a sepsis case, and a 91-year-old on comfort care measures. Chen's bed now belonged to Patricia Helm, an RN from the day shift with 17 years of experience and absolutely no interest in asking questions. But Brooke had anticipated this. She'd anticipated most of Pierce's moves because they followed a pattern as predictable as a heart rhythm strip. Strategic isolation. Institutional weaponization. The shift from loud bullying to quiet erasure. She'd seen it before in military bureaucracies. The moment a threat became significant enough, the response shifted from overt hostility to structural sabotage. Make the person irrelevant. Make them invisible. Make them doubt their own judgment. What Pierce didn't account for was that she'd already built her evidence trail. During the 72 hours between her humiliation in the break room and her reassignment, Brooke had documented every clinical observation about Chen's deteriorating status in meticulous detail. Elevated heart rate, 104 beats per minute, trending upward. Oxygen saturation, 91% on 6 liters of supplemental oxygen, a decline from 96% the day prior. Respiratory rate, 22 breaths per minute. The subtle shift in his chest imaging, a radiologist's note she'd pulled from the PACS system, suggested early pulmonary atelectasis on the right lower lobe. Telemetry showed occasional premature ventricular contractions. The clinical picture whispered one word to anyone trained to listen: thromboembolism. Specifically, a pulmonary embolism building in the vessels of his lungs like a dam constructed from platelets and fibrin. She'd written it all in Chen's chart in the precise language of medical notation, the kind that left no room for interpretation or dismissal. Subjective, patient reports dyspnea on exertion and pleuritic chest discomfort when turning in bed. Objective, HR 104, RR 22, O2 SAT 91% RA, slight decrease in breath sounds right lower lobe. Assessment, monitor for signs of thromboembolic event given immobility status post-major trauma. Plan, serial vital signs Q2H, notify attending of any further deterioration. The chart became a paper trail of her predictions. 3 entries over 36 hours. 3 opportunities for Pierce to acknowledge the risk, order a D-dimer test, initiate VTE prophylaxis beyond the sequential compression devices already in place. 3 moments where a competent physician would have recognized the warning signs of a complication that killed more post-trauma patients than the original wound ever did. Pierce dismissed each one with a single sentence in his own documentation: no acute change. Continue current management. No D-dimer. No imaging beyond what had already been done. No intervention. Just the slow certainty of a developing catastrophe that he refused to see. The pattern served his financial interests perfectly. A stable patient in ICU longer than necessary meant inflated daily ICU charges. A patient with complications, serious complications requiring emergency procedures, meant trauma codes that reimbursed 5 times what routine ICU care generated. A patient who crashed and required intensive intervention meant a dramatic reversal of fortune, a story Pierce could later tell about pulling someone back from the brink. The money was already built into the system. He was simply waiting to see which narrative would pay more. Brooke worked around him. On the first evening after her reassignment, she passed Chen's room during a supply run. Patricia Helm was at the bedside, checking vital signs with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Chen was awake, semi-conscious, his dark eyes tracking movement without quite focusing. His chest rose and fell in the shallow pattern of someone breathing harder than his body should require. "How's he doing?" Brooke asked, keeping her voice neutral, just a colleague making conversation. Patricia glanced up. "Stable. Pierce says he's tracking well. Another day or 2 and he should be ready for transfer to step down." Another day or 2. The words landed like a clinical death sentence to anyone reading the signs Brooke had documented. Not because Chen would die from his injuries, he wouldn't. But because the embolism building in his lungs would rupture into his pulmonary arteries with the certainty of physics, and when it did, it would do so catastrophically. The next morning, Brooke's reassignment became institutional. A memo from the nursing director appeared in her mailbox, copied to the staff bulletin board. It cited her recent disciplinary concerns and performance irregularities and determined that in the interest of patient safety and professional development, Ms. Sullivan will be assigned to lower acuity ICU beds pending a 30-day probationary review. The language was surgical. Technically inoffensive. Structurally devastating. It meant no access to Chen. No justification for checking his chart beyond what a casual observer might do. No standing to advocate if his condition changed. The institutional walls had been erected, and Pierce had made sure they were high enough that no amount of professional argument could scale them. Brooke accepted the memo without protest. She filed it in her personnel folder. She began her shift working the assigned beds, monitoring her post-op patient's telemetry, adjusting sedation on the sepsis case, providing comfort measures to the 91-year-old whose breathing had become shallow and whose family had agreed on a do not resuscitate order. The work was necessary. The work was important. The work was also a cover that allowed her to move through the ICU without arousing suspicion about her real intentions. At 2:44 in the afternoon on the second day after her reassignment, alarms began sounding from Chen's room. Not the casual beeping of a loose lead or a temporary oxygen dip. The full orchestra of ICU crisis, the ventilator alarm, the heart rate alarm, the blood pressure monitor screaming its escalating tone as numbers plummeted toward 0. Brooke heard it from 3 rooms away, from behind a patient privacy curtain, while she was adjusting an 4-line, She didn't run. Running would draw attention, would raise questions about why a nurse on probationary reassignment was suddenly moving with the urgency of someone who knew exactly what crisis was unfolding. Instead, she finished the full adjustment with mechanical precision, double-checked the rate, and then walked toward Chen's room with the measured pace of someone responding to clinical chaos with professional composure. The hallway was already crowded. Patricia Helm stood at the bedside, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone executing the code protocol. 2 respiratory therapists flanked the bed. An attending from cardiology had appeared, not Pierce, thank God, someone with actual competence, and was already calling out orders in the sharp staccato of emergency medicine. The code team was assembling. The crash cart stood open like a surgical instrument tray. Brooke positioned herself at the threshold, taking in the clinical picture in the 2.3 seconds it took for her eyes to track across the monitors, the patient, the team. The rhythm on the monitor told her everything. Ventricular fibrillation. The chaotic electrical storm of a heart that had lost all synchronized contraction. Chen's body lay motionless except for the compressions being delivered by Patricia, who was performing CPR with her full body weight behind each compression, her shoulders driving downward 30 times per minute with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd done it correctly 100 times but had still never quite mastered the emotional weight of forcing someone's ribs open to force their heart to beat. But the compressions weren't working. That was obvious from the monitor, from the way the electrical activity remained disorganized, from the way the attending kept calling still VFib, continue compressions every 90 seconds through another round of epinephrine. 2 minutes of compressions. 3. Brooke's hands were already moving, opening the crash cart from muscle memory, locating the defibrillator pads that Patricia was already placing across Chen's chest. The machine cycled. Delivered a shock. The body on the bed arced upward with the unnatural grace of electrical current passing through muscle tissue. Still VFib. The attending looked at the monitor with the expression of someone watching a clinical failure develop in real time. He needs ROSC or we're looking at, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the mathematics of cardiac arrest. Each minute without return of spontaneous circulation degraded survival probability by approximately 7 to 10%. They were approaching the point where the brain damage from hypoxia would exceed the damage from whatever had caused the arrest in the first place. That was when Pierce appeared in the doorway. His face held the expression of someone watching his financial investment collapse, which, in a clinical sense, it was. A stable patient who'd been lying in his ICU bed generating passive revenue had just become a critical emergency that required intervention he hadn't anticipated and compensation he hadn't structured. We need to move him to OR for ECMO consideration, the attending said, not as a suggestion but as a clinical imperative. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. A machine that would bypass his lungs and heart entirely, doing the work of both until, hopefully, the underlying pathology resolved and his heart could restart. Pierce's mouth opened. I don't think we have time for transport. We should focus on. Transport is happening, the attending cut him off. His tone made it clear this was no longer Pierce's ICU, Pierce's patient, Pierce's decision. The clinical emergency had transferred authority to someone with actual training. Let's get him moving. Call ECMO coordinator. Someone get OR to clear a bed. The next minute became a cascade of motion. The crash team lifted Chen's still form onto the transport stretcher while maintaining compression rhythms. The respiratory therapist positioned the ambu bag, hand ventilating with the focused intensity of someone keeping a dying man's brain supplied with oxygen through sheer force of will. Monitors were disconnected from the bedside unit and transferred to portable equipment. The attending continued calling out interventions, each one precise, each one executed with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had trained for exactly this scenario. Pierce stepped back into the hallway, his expression shifting from investment anxiety to something colder. Strategic calculation. Brooke saw the moment his mind pivoted from protecting his patient to protecting himself. She'd seen that look before, in military settings, in personnel offices, in any place where institutional hierarchy met personal threat. It was the expression of someone realizing that this particular disaster had the potential to expose everything hidden beneath the surface. She watched him reach for his phone as the team pushed the stretcher toward the elevator. One call. Then another. Then a third. The conversations were brief, conducted in the quiet voice of someone who understood that the next 72 hours would determine whether he remained a respected physician or became an artifact of federal investigation. By the time the elevator doors closed and Chen's unstable form disappeared upward toward whatever salvation the ECMO team might provide, Pierce had already set the institutional machinery in motion to ensure that if something went wrong, if Chen died, if his condition deteriorated, if the complications mounted, there would be a scapegoat already prepared. A nurse on probation who'd been documenting his decisions. A nurse whose observations about Chen's deteriorating status could be reframed as alarmism, as overreach, as the kind of excessive charting that indicated poor judgment and professional instability. The hallway emptied as quickly as it had filled. Patricia remained at the bedside, disconnecting the now silent monitors, straightening the linens, preparing the bed for whatever happened next. Her hands moved with the exhausted precision of someone who'd just tried very hard to save a life and had failed. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby, indifferent to human suffering or institutional corruption or the intricate web of decisions that had led to this exact moment. Brooke stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds, committing everything to memory: the smell of antiseptic and fear sweat, the monitor's silence, the empty bed, the way Patricia's shoulders curved inward in defeat. Then she turned and walked back to her assigned rooms, her face composed, her breathing measured, her hand steady, the mask of a deferential ICU nurse perfectly intact, while underneath, the captain who'd survived 72-hour siege conditions in Tikrit was already calculating what came next. The alarm came first, a shriek that split the third night into before and after. Brooke was in the supply closet when it happened, restocking 14-gauge angiocath needles, her hands moving through the mechanical ritual of inventory while her mind stayed fixed on Chen's blood oxygen numbers from the evening rounds, 89% and drifting lower despite the supplemental oxygen Pierce had grudgingly ordered. The monitor's wail reached her even through the closed door, that particular pitch that meant cardiac arrest, and her body knew before her brain did, the way muscle memory works when it's been burned into nervous tissue by 72 hours of siege conditions and 14 surgeries in a sandstorm field tent outside Tikrit. She moved. The ICU erupted into controlled chaos, the kind that happens when trained people recognize catastrophe. Brooke emerged from the supply closet to find Chen's room a constellation of medical violence, 3 nurses compressing the bed rails, the crash cart already positioned, monitors shrieking their flatline song. Chen's parents stood in the hallway, his mother's hand pressed over her mouth like she could push the sounds back in. The diagnosis was written in the pattern of his collapse, sudden, massive, the kind of presentation that screamed pulmonary embolism. A clot had broken free from somewhere in his legs, traveled through his right heart, and arrested the machinery of his chest. Dr. Pierce stood at the foot of the bed, motionless. Not frozen in the way civilians freeze, there was something worse in his stance, something that looked like calculation. His hands hung at his sides. His eyes tracked the monitors, but his body didn't move toward the crash cart, didn't reach for the defibrillator, didn't do any of the things that keeping someone alive requires. He was watching the moment unfold like it was happening to someone else's patient, and Brooke understood in that crystalline instant that he was running the mathematics of exposure. If Chen died now, there would be no one to question the billing codes. No one to examine the phantom procedures on his charts. No one to unravel the careful fraud that had been subsidizing his salary for 18 months. She didn't hesitate. The charge nurse, Patricia, glanced up and saw Brooke in the doorway. "We need," but Brooke was already moving, already grabbing the scalpel from the crash cart with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from hands that have performed emergency thoracotomies in the dark with nothing but a headlamp and the sound of mortar fire. She could feel the weight of it, familiar weight, the weight of combat medicine where hesitation meant death and protocol was a luxury for hospitals with functioning blood banks. "Move," she said to the nurses clustered around Chen's torso. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The left anterolateral thoracotomy site was already marked by anatomy and urgency. She made the incision with a confidence that should have terrified everyone in the room, should have triggered protocol violations and emergency calls to administration. Instead, what happened was that the room reorganized around her competence like iron filings around a magnet. A nurse moved without being asked to expose the fourth intercostal space. Another had already opened the thoracotomy tray. The anesthesiologist's hand steadied as he watched her work, no shaking, no hesitation, just the terrible skill of someone who had done this before when the alternative was watching a patient die on a field tent's canvas floor. The ribs cracked open like a book of vital knowledge. 1 breath. 2 breaths. The lungs were pale, bloodless, the massive PE visible like a sculpture of death itself blocking the pulmonary artery. Her hands moved on their own, irrigation, careful visualization, the satin sky clamp positioned exactly where it needed to be to control the bleeding while she worked. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical support. Oxygen saturation, 68%. 72%. The monitor's rhythm was still absent, still flatline, that horrible electronic scream of a heart that had stopped believing in tomorrow. She found the pulmonary artery. She opened it. And then her hands, these hands that had held 43 lives together in Tikrit despite being covered in her own blood, began manual cardiac massage. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that only comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. Gentle. Rhythmic. The kind of touch that says, I know how to bring you back. I've done this before. I will do it again. 1 minute. 2 minutes. O2 climbing, 74%. 81%. The monitor's rhythm shifted, a flutter, then a blip, then the blessed return of electrical activity that meant the heart remembered how to want to live. Sinus rhythm. Slow, weak, but present. Chen's eyes flickered. The room held its breath. Brooke sutured the pulmonary artery closure with the same steady hands. Foot 0 proline, every stitch a promise. The ribs came back together with careful approximation. Each layer closed like the pages of that book shutting on a second chance that shouldn't have been possible. By the time she finished, Chen was breathing on his own, oxygen saturation climbing toward 92%, his heart beating in a rhythm that meant he had survived something that was supposed to be unsurvivable. His mother was crying. His father had his arm around her, tears streaming down both their faces, gratitude pouring out of them like something physical and real and unconditional. The ICU staff stood in clusters near the nursing station, voices low, eyes cutting sideways toward Brooke as she walked to the staff bathroom to wash Chen's blood from her hands and forearms. She could hear the whispers without actually hearing words, that particular frequency of shock and confusion that happens when someone just revealed a skill set that no civilian trauma nurse should possess. The water ran dark red. She watched it swirl away, watched her hands emerge clean and unmarked, steady as stone. Her phone showed for missed calls from a number she recognized. Her handler. The Pentagon liaison who had placed her here 8 months ago with the directive, watch, document, observe. Don't intervene. She had just violated the most fundamental rule of undercover operations. Dr. Pierce emerged from Chen's room and his eyes found her across the ICU with the kind of precision that only comes from knowing exactly where your threat is standing. His face had cycled through shock into something far more dangerous, calculation. She could see him running through his network, his connections, the favors he was owed and the leverage he possessed. He turned and walked toward the administrative offices, his phone already in his hand, and Brooke understood that the next 2 hours would determine everything. By 2100 hours, the hospital president had arrived in the ICU. By 2130, state nursing board investigators were requesting her credentials and credentials files. By 2200, Pierce's contacts in Maryland, at the nursing licensing facility listed on her fraudulent background, were reporting significant discrepancies in her employment history. Her references, carefully constructed by the Pentagon's administrative team, had suddenly become impossible to verify. One facility claimed no record of her employment. Another stated they had never heard the name Brooke Sullivan. Security arrived at 0547 with a cardboard box. She was escorted out of Cedar Creek Medical before the sun rose, her badge confiscated, her locker contents emptied into the box with the same ceremonial disrespect that military separations carry. The charge nurse wouldn't make eye contact. The nurses who'd worked beside her during the code looked away as she passed. Chen's parents tried to approach her near the elevators, gratitude still fresh on their faces, but security moved between them like they were paid to erase her from the building's geography. The walk through the ICU was longer than it had been during her 3 tours of Tikrit. Past the bulletin board where Pierce's disciplinary write-up still hung, accusation and lies laminated and public. Past the break room where staff turned toward the wall as she moved through. Past Chen's room where he remained unconscious but alive, his chest rising and falling with the kind of breath that Brooke had fought to restore. Pierce stood in his office window, arms crossed, victorious, watching her carry her life out in cardboard. The parking lot was empty. Rain was falling with the kind of insistence that suggests the sky has had enough of Earth's complications. Brooke sat in her car with the engine off, hand shaking for the first time since the code, trembling not from fear but from the kind of adrenaline crash that comes when the battle ends and the body remembers it's still alive. 8 months of undercover work, destroyed in 3 minutes of honesty. Her mission, to document Pierce's fraud, to build a case that would stand up to federal prosecutors, was now worthless. She was blown. Compromised. Useless as an intelligence asset. The only thing she'd accomplished was saving Chen's life. She drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward Highway 64, toward the diner that had survived longer than most things, toward the kind of anonymity that comes with terrible fluorescent lighting and coffee that tastes like diesel fuel. At 0315, she sat in a corner booth, watching her reflection in the dark window. The coffee grew cold in front of her, untouched, forgotten. Her hands were steady now but empty. She reached down and pulled the unit patch from its hiding place, the faded embroidered insignia she'd sewn into her jacket lining before she'd retired from the Navy. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, Tikrit Rotation 2018. The patch felt small in her palm, the thread worn from being pressed against her ribs for 8 months like an accusation. She'd failed her mission. She'd blown her cover. She'd exposed combat skills that were supposed to remain invisible. But Marcus Chen was alive. Her phone sat dark on the table beside the cooling coffee, waiting for a decision she didn't have the authority to make. Jackson was probably awake by now, wondering where she was, checking his phone for messages she wasn't ready to send. The diner hummed around her, the refrigerator's mechanical complaint, the fluorescent hum of lights that had buzzed the same way since 1987, the sound of the rain against the windows like fingers tapping for entry. She was holding the patch when the first sedan pulled into the parking lot. Then the second. Then the third, spreading across the asphalt in a pattern that suggested official business and governmental authority. Brooke watched in the window's reflection as figures emerged from the vehicles, military bearing, dress uniforms, the kind of organizational precision that only happens when someone very specific calls very important people at 0400 in the morning and says words that make the federal apparatus respond. One figure walked toward the diner entrance. Then another. Then a third. The door chimed as it opened, letting in November cold and the smell of rain and diesel exhaust and something else, something that smelled like Tikrit, like purpose, like the sound of helicopters at dawn. The man in the lead was wearing the insignia of a Marine colonel. Behind him came someone in Navy dress whites with 2 stars on the shoulder boards. Behind them, a woman in a Pentagon liaison suit, moving with the kind of quiet authority that only comes from having access to classified information and the willingness to use it. They saw her before she could move. The colonel's eyes locked on her face across the diner, and his expression shifted into something that looked like relief. "Captain Sullivan," he said, his voice filling the diner with the kind of command presence that made the waitress put down her coffee pot. "We need you to come with us. There's a hearing at Cedar Creek in 4 hours, and we need to clarify some things about your service record." Security arrived at 5:56 a.m. with a cardboard box and a confiscated badge. Brooke didn't argue. She didn't even blink as the 2 officers, both looking thoroughly uncomfortable, escorted her down the corridor where she'd spent 8 months documenting every breath, every heartbeat, every fraudulent code that Dr. Pierce had submitted. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and rain from the open loading dock doors. Her locker had been cleared by someone else. Everything she owned, the spare scrubs, the hand cream, the photograph of Jackson from his 13th birthday, sat in that box like evidence from a crime scene she'd committed by saving a life. The officer placed her ID badge on top, the lanyard coiled like a snake, and looked away. "Hospital policy," he said quietly. "Not an apology. Just a fact." Brooke took the box without speaking and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness where rainwater pooled on the asphalt and her car sat waiting like a reminder of the life she was no longer qualified to have. By 3 a.m., she was sitting in a booth at Mel's Diner on Highway 64, the kind of place where the coffee came in chipped ceramic mugs and nobody asked questions. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made the world look like a photograph from 30 years ago. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't touched it. Instead, Brooke sat perfectly still, her scarred hands that had cracked open chests in sandstorms and IED-torn operating theaters, wrapped around the mug like it was the only warm thing left. Through the diner window, Highway 64 stretched toward Raleigh, toward Cedar Creek Medical, toward the rubble of the operation that was supposed to be simple. 18 months. That's all she'd been supposed to stay. Document the patterns, pass the evidence to NCIS, disappear back into classified assignment rotation. Instead, she'd stayed 8 months and let herself believe a Navy SEAL with a lethal pulmonary embolism was just another patient. That had been the mistake. That had been the moment she stopped being an intelligence asset and became something dangerous, a nurse who actually saved lives instead of just documenting fraud. The unit patch pressed against her ribs inside her jacket lining. She'd kept it from Tikrit, the one thing the administrative decommissioning had allowed her to carry. Faded now, the embroidered reaper barely visible, the eagle's talon so worn it looked like a claw made of dust. She'd sewn it in herself with field medical kit sutures on a night when she couldn't sleep, when the weight of 17 consecutive casualties had made her hands shake for the first time in a decade. Now it felt like an accusation. Like proof of everything she'd hidden. The other nurses had called her meticulous. Dr. Pierce had called her obsessive. Neither of them understood that every single notation in Chen's chart, every flagged abnormality, every documented deviation from protocol had been evidence collection for a federal investigation. They'd seen a deferential woman in scrubs taking orders. They'd never seen the captain who'd led surgical teams through active combat, who'd taught 18 field surgeries to combat medics before most people finished their morning coffee. But that wasn't the worst part. The hospital had already called 3 times that night. The last message came at 2:15 a.m. from someone she didn't recognize, a Pentagon liaison with a voice like gravel in a diesel engine. "Captain Sullivan, we need you for a hearing at Cedar Creek Medical at 7 this morning. Lieutenant Commander Chen regained consciousness at 2,300 hours last night. He's been asking for you. And we have some things to clarify about your service record." Not a request. Not even a question. A military directive wrapped in bureaucratic language that meant her cover was gone, her operation was unraveling, and in approximately 4 hours, everything she'd hidden for 8 months would be exposed in an executive boardroom while Dr. Pierce tried to defend his patterns to people who already knew exactly what he'd done. She didn't go home to change. She didn't sleep. At 6:27 a.m., Brooke walked into Cedar Creek Medical wearing the same scrub she'd been escorted out in, carrying the cardboard box with her confiscated badge, and rode the elevator to the executive level. The boardroom doors were closed. Behind them, she could hear Pierce's voice, agitated, defensive, the tone of a man who understood something fundamental had shifted in the universe and he didn't know yet how far the fall would be. Jackson was waiting outside the boardroom. Her 17-year-old son stood with his shoulders back, his jaw set in the way that meant he'd made a decision he wasn't going to walk back from. In his hands, he held a shadow box. Brooke's shadow box. The one she'd kept in the back of a closet for 8 years, the one she'd made Jackson promise he would never show to anyone. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that same flat precision she recognized in her own. "It's time." He didn't wait for her response. He kicked the boardroom door open, actually kicked it, the kind of aggressive action that made everyone at the conference table flinch, and walked in carrying the shadow box like it was a religious relic. The door swung back and hit the frame with a sound that echoed through the corridor. Behind him, Brooke heard Dr. Pierce start to speak, heard someone gasp, heard the hospital president's chair scrape backward. Inside the shadow box, The Navy Cross hung from its ribbon. Below it, 2 purple hearts arranged in precise symmetry. Below that, combat citations, declassified photographs, and a certificate of commendation signed by a 4-star admiral in 2013. Jackson placed the box on the mahogany conference table with absolute care. Then he stepped back and waited. "What is this?" Pierce's voice had shifted. The defensive edge was gone, replaced by something that sounded like ice forming. "What is she telling you?" Nobody answered. The room had that quality of silence that only comes when people are realizing they've been operating with incomplete information for a very long time. Then the boardroom doors opened again, and Marcus Chen rolled in. He was in a wheelchair, his frame still lean from hospitalization, but his eyes were clear and conscious and full of recognition. His parents followed him, Chen's father's hand steady on the wheelchair's grip. An orderly had brought him from his recovery room, down the corridor, to this boardroom where he had no reason to be except that someone had told him it was important. Chen looked at the shadow box. Then he looked at Brooke, and his scarred face, burned across the left side from an IED blast, the same IED that had nearly killed him in Tikrit, split into something that wasn't quite a smile but held the same weight. "Reaper 6, he said. His voice was hoarse, barely functioning after 3 days of post-operative recovery, but his words cut through the silence like a scalpel. "That's her call sign. Reaper 6. She ran Forward Surgical Team 3 in Jolin District for 47 consecutive days. A Marine colonel in dress blue stood up. Brooke hadn't seen him enter, but he was there now, rigid with military bearing, his service uniform so precise it looked like he'd been carved from regulations. He had a file in his hands. He opened it and began to read in that particular voice reserved for formal military citations, slow, deliberate, every word a fact that couldn't be questioned. Captain Brooke Marie Sullivan, Naval Special Operations Warrior, 42 months active duty as Commanding Officer of Forward Surgical Team 3, United States Naval Fleet Marines Force. Citation for extraordinary heroism under enemy fire, Tikrit, Iraq, September 2013. For extraordinary heroism demonstrated during continuous combat operations spanning 72 hours, during which Captain Sullivan performed 18 consecutive field surgeries in active hostile fire zones, maintained casualty survival rate of 94% under conditions where standard military doctrine predicted 78%, trained and directed 8 Marine Corpsmen in advanced trauma procedures, and refused medical evacuation despite sustaining 2 gunshot wounds and 1 IED fragmentation injury to continue providing surgical care. Pierce had gone very still. His hands were flat on the conference table. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The colonel continued reading. Second Purple Heart awarded for wound sustained during secondary IED blast while conducting emergency thoracotomy in field conditions. Silver Star awarded for tactical command decisions that resulted in protection of 7 civilian medical personnel under direct fire. Navy Cross awarded for heroic leadership and surgical innovation that directly resulted in preservation of life during combat conditions that would have resulted in mass casualty event. He turned the citation around so the table could see the signature. A 4-star admiral. A Joint Chiefs of Staff seal. Documentation that meant Brooke Sullivan hadn't been a civilian nurse at Cedar Creek Medical, she'd been something far more dangerous to anyone with something to hide. Furthermore, the colonel said, Captain Sullivan's assignment to Cedar Creek Medical was a classified federal investigation designated Operation Nightingale. Her purpose was documentation and evidence collection regarding systematic Medicare fraud in military-affiliated medical facilities. She has been acting in official capacity as a federal investigator throughout her tenure here. The Pentagon liaison stepped forward. She was a woman in her 50s with eyes that had seen enough classified operations that nothing about this situation seemed to surprise her. She was holding a file folder so thick it required both hands. She opened it directly in front of Dr. Pierce. Inside were copies. All of them. 14 months of billing documentation. Highlighted in yellow and blue and pink, each notation a different fraudulent code. Alongside each code, Brooke's notes in the margins, precise, detailed, cross-referenced with actual patient conditions and required interventions. Patient in coma, Minimal respiratory support required. Code submitted, level for critical trauma. Routine post-operative recovery, standard monitoring. Code submitted, acute cardiopulmonary event. Stable patient, 3 days post-op, no complications. Code submitted, emergency intervention, multiple system failure. Dr. Pierce tried to stand. He sat back down. His attorney, a sharp-looking woman in a charcoal suit, leaned over and whispered something urgent. Pierce shook his head. The attorney whispered again, louder this time. Don't answer. Don't say another word. We're done talking, the hospital president said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Dr. Robert Pierce, you are terminated, effective immediately. All hospital privileges are suspended pending state board investigation. Security will escort you from the premises. Pierce's face had gone the color of old concrete. You don't understand. The billing codes came from the compliance office. I was following their recommendations. I didn't generate those codes myself. This is a setup. This is political. I've dedicated 23 years to this hospital. 23 years of this, the liaison said quietly, turning a page to show another annotated code. And then another. The pattern was clear now, systematic, intentional, methodical. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. Fraud. Pure, documented, undeniable fraud. The colonel removed his cover, his dress blue hat, and held it against his chest. In that simple gesture was the entire military hierarchy's acknowledgement that Brooke Sullivan wasn't the nurse they'd all been treating with dismissal and contempt. She was a captain. She outranked every person in that room. She'd been conducting an investigation while they'd been conducting business as usual. Captain Sullivan was doing her job, the two-star general said. He'd arrived in the last 30 seconds, stepping into the boardroom with the kind of authority that made everyone straighten their spine instinctively. She was protecting the integrity of federal healthcare programs. She was protecting her patient. And she was protecting the dignity of every military service member who came through that door expecting to receive ethical care. He turned to face Brooke directly. Then, in a gesture that made Jackson's eyes widen and Chen's father cover his mouth, the general saluted. Not a casual acknowledgement but a full-dress salute, fist to chest, held for 3 full seconds. An officer to an officer. A warrior to a warrior. Brooke returned it. Her hand moved with muscle memory 1,000 years old, precise and absolute. The hearing dissolved into chaos after that. Pierce's attorney made demands. The hospital president made calls. State investigators who'd been waiting in the parking lot were escorted into the conference room with a search warrant for Pierce's office. By 8:15 a.m., he was gone. His career ended in the same way his victims had been ending: bureaucratic termination, official dissolution, removal from a place where he no longer belonged. 6 months later, Dr. Robert Pierce stood in front of a plastic CPR dummy in a beige classroom at Raleigh Community College. He was wearing the kind of polo shirt that had a college logo on the chest, the uniform of someone teaching remedial skills for $16 an hour. His audience was 12 bored healthcare workers fulfilling continuing education credits, most of them staring at their phones. And that's chest compression depth, Pierce said, demonstrating on the dummy with movements that had lost all of their authority. Push down at least 2 inches. You're pushing on plastic, gentlemen and ladies. Think about the actual physiology. Nobody was listening. A student in the back row raised her hand. Is this going to be on anything? Or can we just sign the attendance sheet? Pierce turned away from the dummy. That's when he saw it, the television mounted in the waiting room visible through the classroom glass partition. The news segment was playing on mute, but the image was unmistakable. Cedar Creek Medical's renovated ICU. A ribbon-cutting ceremony. The hospital president shaking hands with a woman in navy dress whites, the kind of uniform reserved for formal occasions and official recognition. Captain Brooke Sullivan appeared on screen, her insignia gleaming under the camera lights, her hand shaking with the hospital president as a banner unfurled behind them, Cedar Creek Medical's new director of veteran services. Pierce's hand froze on the dummy's chest. The student asked him if he was okay. He didn't answer. He was watching Brooke on screen, watching her receive commendation after commendation, watching a man in a wheelchair, the SEAL, the patient Pierce had nearly killed, salute her as she stood beside him in physical therapy. Marcus Chen was walking. Unassisted. His parents stood in the background crying again, but this time the tears were visible even on the muted screen. Pierce had no sound, but he understood exactly what had happened. The weapon he'd activated against Brooke, the outside investigators, the credential checks, the formal complaints designed to end her career, had become the mechanism of his own professional destruction. Everything he'd done in the boardroom that morning, every defensive response, every attempted justification, had been documented. Everything Brooke had protected, every meticulous notation, every careful annotation, had been evidence that would be introduced in federal court. He turned back to the dummy and continued demonstrating compressions to 12 people who didn't care. That was his career now. That was what remained. Meanwhile, in Cedar Creek Medical's renovated ICU, Brooke Sullivan stood in an office that had her name on the door. Captain. Director. Officer. The nameplate gleamed under the lights. On her office wall hung the framed unit patch, no longer hidden inside a jacket lining but visible to everyone, proof of service, documentation of identity. Beside it hung her citations, her medals photographed and preserved under glass, her career arc transformed from classified secret to institutional recognition. Through her office window, she could see into the trauma bay. Marcus Chen was in physical therapy, taking his first unassisted steps, his parents watching from the sidelines. Jackson stood beside Brooke, finally understanding why his mother had spent so many nights reviewing patient files at their kitchen table. Why she'd kept those scrubs spotless. Why documentation mattered more than comfort. Why a nurse who'd been trained to lead combat surgical teams had been willing to work minimum wage just to protect veterans. You were helping people the whole time, Jackson said. He was looking at Chen, watching the man walk without assistance for the first time in months. Even when they didn't know it. Brooke nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Some things didn't need words. Some things just needed presence, consistency, the kind of quiet strength that shows up and does the work no matter who's watching. A young nurse appeared in the doorway. Captain Sullivan, we have an incoming trauma. Vehicle accident, veteran from active duty, critical condition. ETA 8 minutes. Brooke's demeanor shifted. The administrative focus gave way to something far more fundamental, the operational readiness of someone trained for crisis, someone whose hands remembered every procedure, whose mind calculated triage faster than most people could panic. She was Captain again. She was Reaper 6 again. She was exactly where she needed to be. I have to go, she told Jackson. He smiled. He understood. I know, Mom. Go save someone. She strode toward the trauma bay, her dress whites catching the fluorescent lights, her insignia gleaming like proof of identity finally made public. Behind her, Jackson watched his mother transform, the quiet nurse becoming the warrior, the hidden operator becoming the leader, the woman who'd spent 8 months documenting fraud becoming the officer who would spend the rest of her career protecting people no one else would think to look out for. As Brooke pushed through the trauma bay doors, the emergency klaxon began to wail. She could already hear the ambulance sirens in the distance, getting closer, getting louder, bringing another patient who needed exactly what she had to offer. She began calling orders. The entire room moved with her. Nurses. Techs. Residents. All of them responding to a voice they'd finally learned to trust. Trauma Bay 1. For access, 2 large ball lines. Get me 2 units Type O, EKG monitor. Continuous pulse ox. And somebody call blood bank, we're going to need more than that. One of the nurses was the same person who'd scattered when Brooke sat down at the break room table 6 months ago. Now she moved with urgency, responding not to the quiet woman in scrubs but to the officer who understood something they were only beginning to learn, that the person standing beside you might be carrying a war you never knew about, and that's exactly the kind of person you want in a crisis. The ambulance pulled up outside. Brooke could hear the paramedics opening the back doors, hear the rush of activity that meant another patient was coming in, another chance to be what she'd always been, a healer, a protector, a warrior with a stethoscope instead of a rifle. As she moved toward the patient, her voiceover dropped low, carrying the weight of 42 months in combat and 8 months in hiding. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The trauma bay doors burst open. The patient arrived on a stretcher. Brooke was already moving, already in position, already exactly where a captain belongs. That's all for this week, people. If you've been following Brooke's journey from the beginning, you know why this moment matters. Captain Sullivan wasn't just a nurse. She was an entire operation walking through Cedar Creek Medical in scrubs, protecting people nobody else was willing to protect, documenting evidence nobody else was looking for. The quiet ones are always dangerous, not because they're weak, but because you have no idea what they've already survived. If this story hit you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about the people who save us when we're not even watching, and comment, what would you have done in Brooke's position? Let me know in the comments below.